Washington presents Russia with an ultimatum and threatens to halt cooperation on Syria as violence escalates in Aleppo.
Russia will continue to send troops home in body bags.
Also ahead this RT News Hour, a major upset for Barack Obama as the U.S. Senate overwhelmingly votes to nullify his veto of a bill to allow Americans to sue Saudi Arabia over its alleged involvement in the 9/11 attacks. And a boost for the depressed oil market. Prices rise after OPEC finally agrees to cut production for the first time in some 8 years. Just past midday here in Moscow on this Thursday, September the 29th. Welcome to RT International. My name's Ewan O'Neill. Good to have your company. Our top story, the US is threatening to end cooperation with Moscow on Syria unless, quote, Russian and Syrian attacks on Aleppo stop. The ultimatum was made in a phone call between US Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. The US State Department also says it's looking at non-diplomatic options for responding to the situation in the war-torn country.
Extremist groups will continue to exploit the vacuums that are there in Syria to expand their operations, which will include, no question, attacks against Russian interests, perhaps even Russian cities. And Russia will continue to send troops home in body bags. Here at the State Department, the Secretary is still committed to a diplomatic solution. There are other options that don't revolve around the act of diplomacy.
Well, Russia's foreign ministry has reacted to the ultimatum, calling it a policy of threats and blackmail. The U.S. Secretary of State also said Russia was responsible for the worsening situation in Syria. RT's Guy Chichikan went to the U.S. State Department to hear more.
The Washington position is to blame Russia for everything that's going wrong in Syria, while admitting what happened in the days that followed the ceasefire deal. The rebels were reported to have carried out hundreds of ceasefire violations, while the Syrian army actually stopped the strikes. This was during the first few days of the ceasefire, which began on September 12th. Syria's second largest rebel group, Ahrar al-Sham, said right away that they were not going to abide by the deal. On September 17th, the U.S. bombed the Syrian military, admittedly by mistake. And then a humanitarian convoy was hit, which the U.S. blamed on Russia, and Russia vehemently denied having done that. With that, my question at the State Department.
Looking at the events that followed the ceasefire, how is it fair to say that Russia is solely responsible for the failure of this deal?
Because, and we've said this many, many times, they have influence on Assad. I didn't make that up.
Are you saying that you don't have influence with the rebels?
We do, and so do some of our allies and partners as well.
And if the U.S. does have influence with these rebel groups, why the hundreds of ceasefire violations? Why did that happen?
We have influence over some, not all. We have there are
largest rebel group just refused to abide by that deal.
There are other nations that have influence, and again, we have admitted that not all the opposition groups on every single day completely abided by it.
Can you admit that part of the responsibility for the failure of this deal lies with the rebels and with the U.S.?
I think we've been nothing but honest about the fact that there have been violations of the ceasefire and the cessation of hostilities on all sides.
While essentially admitting that the U.S. had not delivered on its responsibilities under this deal, the U.S. now threatens to cut ties with Moscow. Washington says that way it wants to stop Russia's bombing of civilians in Aleppo. And this prompted some of my questions on whether the U.S. is consistent in that regard when it comes to dealing with other countries.
The U.S. has expressed grave concern over what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen by hitting civilian targets there. Why isn't the U.S. threatening to cut ties with Saudi Arabia?
We have, the Secretary talked about this when we were in Jeddah a few weeks ago. We have been honest with the Saudis about our concerns over the lack of precision in some strikes, and we've talked to them about the importance of conducting investigations.
But Saudi Arabia is doing there what Russia is accused of doing in Syria. So
No.
How is that consistent?
Because what we're seeing the Russians do, and I would love to see you ask your government some of these questions. You know, Russia today never does that. You never poke and prod your own government.
This is not the first time John Kirby tries to evade my questions by changing the conversation to RT.
Is it? I'm sorry. Should I not be asking what the U.S. assessment of Turkish actions
I'm going to take this one, Asha, then I'm going to come to you.
Should I not be asking that question? Exactly which question should I be embarrassed about, sir?
You can ask me whatever you want. I'm just stunned that you're not embarrassed by some of the questions you ask. And I notice that RT very rarely asks any tough questions of their own government.
The U.S. strike that reportedly killed around 20 civilians in the ISIL-held city of Manbij in Syria, was it a mistake on Monday?
That's another great accusatory question you've asked here.
Needless to say, this is not going to stop me from asking the State Department questions which I think are fair and informative for our viewers. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chekyan, RT.
Well, former U.S. Congressman Ron Paul and past U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras told us how the current balance of power on the ground might be affected by the ongoing diplomatic spat.
There's a lot of accusations. That's pretty typical. Blame the other side. Let's have a ceasefire, and then each side blames each other for breaking it, and it goes on and on. It's a no-win situation as far as I'm concerned from our point of view, because we just get further involved.
They have to try to put the blame on the Russians for the breakdown of the ceasefire, because otherwise it would point to the fact that there was never any prospect of separating so-called moderates from the radicals. The only thing we can say about restoring the ceasefire, and also the calls we've seen to ground the Russian and Syrian air forces, is to protect the terrorists, especially al-Qaeda, in East Aleppo. At the end of the day, what the Obama administration wants is regime change, and they think somehow they can pressure Moscow into accepting that.
Moving on now, the U.S. Congress has voted overwhelmingly to override President Obama's veto of a bill that would allow Americans to sue Saudi Arabia over the 9/11 terror attacks. It's the first veto override during Obama's time in charge and comes as a major blow to the American leader as he approaches the end of his presidency.
2/3 of the senators voting, a quorum being present. Having voted in the affirmative, the bill on reconsideration is passed, the objections of the President of the United States to the contrary notwithstanding.
I think it was a mistake. It has to do with me not wanting a situation in which we're suddenly exposed to liabilities for all the work that we're doing all around the world. It's a dangerous precedent, and it's an example of why sometimes you have to do what's hard. And frankly, I wish Congress here had done what's hard. I didn't expect it.
Well, 97 congressmen voted to overturn the veto, with just one senator voting against. 2 more abstained. RT's Caleb Maupin found out what the consequences of the move might be.
The 2 chambers of U.S. Congress were united today in delivering a crippling blow to Barack Obama and overturning his veto. They possibly opened a Pandora's box in international relations, as U.S. citizens can now sue Saudi Arabia. But the White House has been palling around with Saudi royalty for decades. But the relationship is about much more than White House visits, with the kingdom functioning as a strategic ally of the U.S. in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia also sells billions of dollars worth of oil to the U.S. every year, with the U.S. selling them a huge cache of Pentagon weapons in return. Obama claimed the bill was against American interests, but U.S. legislators were firm. In response, Saudi Arabia has threatened to pull as much as $750 billion in assets from American banks. U.S. officials were quick to condemn Congress.
I would venture to say that this is the single most embarrassing thing that the United States Senate has done, possibly since 1983.
I think it is a very, very dangerous and slippery slope that we are going to get on. Foreign governments are going to start to pass similar types of legislation that is going to haul the United States into court overseas, even for the most frivolous of charges and allegations for what the US has done overseas.
The originally classified 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report are now available to the U.S. public 15 years later, showing that several of the hijackers received assistance from the Saudi government. court proceedings could open up even more information about Saudi involvement. But the White House is not keen on that, focusing instead on political games at home. After all, it was the first veto override during Obama's presidency.
The fact that the president hasn't vetoed that many bills, I think, is a pretty damning indictment of the effectiveness of Republicans in Congress.
The Obama presidency enters its final months, and the election campaign is in full swing. So the question of whether it will be remembered for trying to protect the Saudi royal family is a pressing one. Caleb Maupin, RT, Washington, D.C.
Well, we heard from 9/11 survivor Rick DeSantis, who says that the move by Congress will allow victims of the tragedy to legally demand for the resumption of previously dismissed lawsuits now.
After 15 years, we finally, with legal standing, have the right to file legitimate legal complaints, providing the necessary and appropriate subpoena power and discovery of evidence periods and rights. It allows for the resumption of many lawsuits that go all the way back to 2002, including the most recent lawsuit dismissed in August 2015 arbitrarily without a jury by the same judge that, also serving as an administrative judge, arbitrarily awarded Larry Silverstein $5 billion after he was denied on his claim for the two towers by the insurance policies and the insurance companies that provided that coverage only months before the attacks. This judge dismissed or removed the case against Saudi Arabia, claiming Saudi Arabia was exempt based on sovereign immunity exemptions.